and let him steal the show for a little while.
You'll have to forgive me, I'm not used to talking into a microphone.
This is my presentation, Austin on Rails, AntiPatterns. So a little bit about myself. I'm a Rails developer for Gowalla. I have exactly one line of code in Rails 3.1. Feel free to ask me about it later. I do some teaching for CabForward as well as Engine Yard, and this presentation is kind of a very, very extremely super condensed version of one minor part of a class that I give in AntiPatterns. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out CabForward. If you're interested, I say funny things on Twitter at Schneems, and I post code GitHub. Also, my username is Schneems. If you're interested in learning Rails, you don't have any experience, I've got about 8 hours worth of beginner material on Schneems.com. So, yeah, check that out. As I mentioned previously, the AntiPatterns class I typically teach is about 16 hours. It's intermediate to advanced. And this is a 1-hour class about beginner anti-patterns. A lot of you, if you are beginners, probably don't come from a, or you might, but if you're like me, don't come from a computer science background. I'm a mechanical engineer. I just wanted to learn Rails, wanted to just get stuff done, throw it up there, and I was always saying like, okay, well if it works, if it's on the website, if it's showing me what I want to see, it's good enough. And that works really well when you're just getting started. But there are some basic things that if you can, some common things that pretty much everybody and their cousin does when they're just learning Rails, that if you can avoid these things, it makes your life a lot simpler later down the road. So what is an anti-pattern? An anti-pattern is something that people commonly use to solve a problem, but it doesn't quite work. A pattern is a technique that people use to solve a problem, whereas an anti-pattern actually ends up creating more problems. So just show of hands, who's getting started with Rails? Anybody? Anybody? I mean, I've been doing this for about 5 years, and I still feel like I'm getting started sometimes. Are you all familiar with model view controller? Okay, so in Rails we have a model, we also have a view and a controller, these very distinct, separate parts. So in this hour, I'm going to be talking about each one of them in turn, and kind of one common thing that I see. I mentioned I teach Rails classes. I see a lot of beginner code, and I myself have put out a couple of open source projects just trying to learn Rails as a non-coder. So these are things that I've definitely seen. So first of all, we're going to start out with our view layer. And this is what most people think of whenever they start working for a Rails app. It is what you directly touch the most in terms of a browser. You load up a browser, you see HTML. You load Rails, and you have an HTML.erb. Can everybody hear me? Am I? All right, good. Thumbs up. So the view is going to be what displays and formats our information. We don't want it doing any kind of business logic, and that's where our separation of MVC comes from. So, what isn't a view? A view is not where we want to put, absolutely all of our code. You can put, almost everything in your view, and it'll still work. I've seen views that have, hundreds upon hundreds of lines of code, and it still works. But has anybody worked with PHP in the past? Anybody written SQL and put it directly in your view? Okay, don't do that. We're not using PHP. We do have these as clearly separated boundaries. So one of the biggest anti-patterns when you're just getting started is to put SQL inside of your view directly. So here we have a view, and we have user.where username Schneems.first. And that kind of, if you see that in a view, if you see a where, you see a find, that's kind of a big red flag. It's not necessarily bad in and of itself. You know, it will still work. But at the end of the day, if your site gets super huge and you end up on Reddit or, you know, what, Dig? Does anybody use Dig anymore? I don't know. And lots of people start hitting your site, you start getting these performance problems. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to look in your controller and try to optimize these performance issues. If you have SQL in your view, you're never even going to see it. So as I mentioned, there are, it's pretty obvious to see if you've got a where or a find in your view, but there are some other situations you can get into where you are actually running SQL code in your view that you're not even aware of. Rails 3 gave us Active Record along with Arrow. Active Record 3 along with Arrow. So we have all these extensible finding methods. So we have you know, where, we have limit, we have order, and if you see any of these in your view, you want to try and pull them out. This is actually some code that I kind of abstracted away from my very first Rails project. It was an open source dictionary called uniteddictionary.com. If anybody has ever felt bad about writing a horrible web app like ever, this actually exists. You can go to uniteddictionary.com right now, and it is hideous. All of the code is also available, and that too is hideous. But here, essentially what we are doing, we have a definition in this dictionary, and the dictionary can have multiple users. Those users have a rank, and in our view, we're just sorting by rank. We're pulling off the first one from the top, and we're saying that, hey, this is our top user. So in this instance, we want to display the top user for a definition. We don't want this in the view. This is our view code. We want to be able to take that and move it to our controller. So our first AntiPattern of the night, for those of you taking score at home, SQL queries in your view is an AntiPattern. And the solution is to move those queries to your controller. So here would be an example of a controller action that would hit our definition show. So this is going to be showing our definition, and previously we would have just had pulled out at definition. So definition.where ID is params ID. So in addition to that, we also want to pull out our top user instance variable, and it's going to be the exact same query that we had before. We're just now moving it to the controller. Does everybody? The second line of code we have, where can you all kind of see that? Okay, yeah, that helps. Thank you. So the second line of code we have is almost identical to what was in our view. If you're unfamiliar with moving around that code, you can just pretty much just copy and paste it. We have at top users equal to at definition.users order rank descending.first. And there you go. Now whenever your site makes it really big, you get on Reddit and you have performance optimization problems, then you can just go right to your controller and see exactly all of the major queries that you're going to perform. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Don't feel intimidated. Okay.
So at the end of the day, it even looks better. Here is our refactored view with our top user instance variable. Rather than having all that extra code inside of our view, now we just have simply a link to our top user. So not only does it help us find performance problems, but it also, just like I said, it looks better. Generally, you want as much view code, HTML specific code, inside of your view. You want very little SQL, or I even try to minimize the number of ifs and ends, or ifs and else's I have inside of my view. All right, since nobody has any questions about the view, we're going to move on right to the controller. And although we call it MVC, that is the only order that you can't transfer data in. You can't go from the model to the view to the controller. That just doesn't make any sense. Typically, you go from the model to the controller to the view, but as you viewing the web page, you generally look at it backwards, and that's how I like to present it. So that was one view anti-pattern, and now moving on to our controllers. And what exactly is a controller? So we know a view is where we want to display our information. A controller is where we want to put our business logic. Exactly what does that mean? So we saw in the last section that we want to put our SQL inside of our controller. That makes a lot of sense. If you have a lot of, what exactly should we be displaying? Is there a current user? Those kind of things should all go inside of a controller. So by default, Rails is going to map our controllers to what the computer science community will call CRUD. And CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. These are the actions you need to have on any kind of an object, if it's going to be a valid object. If you're going to make something, so for instance we have our definition in last example, we have to be able to create it, we have to be able to show it, which would be read, we have to be able to update it and change things about it, as well as completely delete it. So Rails, by default, whenever you just run Rails scaffold and then the name of your model, your controller, it will generate this controller that has all of these different actions. And the reason these actions are this way, it fully encompasses your CRUD, your create, your read, your update, and your destroy. So what you don't want your controller looking like is a bunch of definitions that are not those. We have our index, our show, our new, our create, our edit, our update, and our destroy. And when you open a Rails app, when I open a Rails app, I expect to find these inside of your controller. One of the very first things I ever did whenever I was starting out was I completely renamed all of them to something that made sense to me. And I didn't just stop here. Like I have one controller action. Like I said, this is available at github.com/schneezy/United Dictionary. There were like 50 methods in this controller. Probably more than that. And it's not something that even I can't stress enough. Anyway. So you will see this very, very commonly in a lot of Rails apps where people just name these things that it makes sense to them. In the Rails world, you want your controller to represent a resource. And that's kind of a complicated, weird idea, but essentially the easiest way that I can remember it is I just generate a scaffold with whatever name of the item I'm working on. So for instance, I would Rails generate scaffold definition, and whatever comes out of that, that's kind of what I want to stick with. So our controller anti-pattern is one controller with many, 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 many methods. And the solution is going to be to use many controllers with about 7 methods. So why 7 methods? Those are the ones that I showed you previously. These are your index, your show, your new, create, edit, update, and destroy. And those correspond to your CRUD actions. And that's pretty much bare bones what you need to get by if you're going to be actually working with some sort of a resource. Sometimes you need a few more. Maybe you might want to have a search action on a resource. Sometimes you need a few less. Maybe you only need to be able to create but never actually destroy. That's fairly common. So that's why I say about 7 methods. So our first rule of controllers is that you never have more than 13 methods in a controller. Okay? Does everyone just kind of nod your head, pretend like yes? Are you going to go home and refactor everything? It's not going to have more than 13 methods in your controller? Okay, I see some nodding. All right, the second rule of controllers is never have more than 13 methods in your controller. Please, it makes things really difficult. And The number 13 is kind of arbitrary. It can be some arbitrary number that you want to pick. Maybe it's 15, maybe it's 11, maybe it's 8. You know, it's just not too many. I think DHH said 13. So if you go over DHH's number, then he will hunt you down because he wrote Rails. So the third rule of controllers is typically don't have more than 7 methods. You really need a good reason if you're going to have more than 7 methods. So I mentioned that you can take these extra methods and split them into multiple controllers. So a lot of you kind of might be saying like, yeah, all right, well, I know I'm not supposed to have more than 13 methods, but what do I actually do with all those extra methods? So chances are if you're running a Rails app, you probably have a user's controller. And if you have a user's controller, you probably have something along the lines of this. A method inside of the user's controller that's like, you know, password. And then one that's reset password, and maybe another one where you actually request the password reset. And you know, at the time when you're writing this, this makes a whole lot of sense. And it's super intuitive. It makes up, you know, you can understand it, but you bring somebody else onto your team, or you even look at your own code next week and you're like, you know, wait a second, what does all this code do? So instead, I recommend move all of that to a password resets controller. You can generate, you know, pretty much a limitless number of controllers. And for some reason, whenever you're just getting started out with Rails, a lot of people just say, you know, are kind of almost afraid of generating controllers, and they just want to stuff everything into one controller. And I think a lot of that has to do with Rails routes, and you know, maybe that's a little bit confusing. But if you just set this limit for yourself, and once you reach those 13, then you actually come out and generate a new controller, you'll be better off for it. So here's an example of what a password resets controller would look like. I mentioned before about 7 methods. And also, for those of you very, you know, not from a computer science background, when I say method, I'm referring to this thing that starts with def. That's actually, we're creating methods. I mentioned I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, so even really small things like that can tend to trip people up when they're getting started. But here we have a edit method, and in this situation, that's going to be the method you actually call to edit the user's email. We have a create, that's going to create the password reset, and that's going to be what sends out, it sends out the email to the user. You know, you get it in your inbox, you click on the link. Finally, we have update, and that's going to be what actually updates the person's password. Note, we're still using those 7 methods, the index, show, all of those. We're actually using less than that, so it's better. If you run into a situation where you are creating a ton of controllers and they only have like 1 method in them, maybe that's a little bit too little. So I would say a sweet spot really is about 3 to 7. So I came up with this little, I don't know, what do you call those things? Anyway, you should smack your controller. And I just wrote this myself, it's not something I got, that's why it's not in order. So first you want to stop and see how many non-standard actions you have. The standard actions are going to be those, I keep on repeating myself over and over again, the index, the create. You want to ask yourself, do they act on another resource? If you have a user's controller and there's a method in there called like admin, maybe it doesn't actually act on that user, maybe it acts on an admin, maybe you need an admin controller. Kind of makes sense. You want to either then move those methods to another resource, if that resource already exists, and you want to possibly create extra controllers. So, like I said, just smack your controllers. They don't get much love anyway. Anybody have any questions about that? It's okay if you do. I'll repeat your question. Don't be intimidated by the microphone voice. Okay. And also if you have questions, feel free to grab me afterwards, or I don't know, somebody else who looks like they might know Rails. Might make for an interesting night. Don't physically grab them. So we covered our views and we covered our controllers. The last section we have with our model, with our MVC, is going to be models. So we moved code from our view to our controller, and now we're going to want to move code from our controller to our view. You might have heard this phrase before if you've read maybe like the Agile web development with Rails, skinny controllers, fat models, or even just seen it on the web. And you're like, okay, yeah, skinny controllers, fat models. Like, but wait a second, what does that actually mean? Essentially, you want your controller to be skinny, really small. You want your controller to maybe be like 20, 30 lines of code. And you want your models to be huge. So if you have a user's controller, and if your user's controller has more lines of code than your user's model, that's not a skinny model, that's not a skinny controller, and that's not a fat model. So kind of continuing with the same example, we were able to take that chunk of code and move it from our view to our controller. Now we're going to want to take and move it a step further. We're going to want to take this same line, our top user's line, and we're going to actually want to put that inside of our model. So we have a definition model, and we can define a top user's method on definitions. So for each definition, it will have a top user. And it's exactly the same as you saw before, the exact same code. I mean, we have users.order, rank, descending.first. It's just in a different place. The reason this is really convenient, this is really useful, is if you ever need it again, if you ever need it in another controller, if you ever need it in another view, anywhere else you need this, it is kind of like this is your canonical version of a top user for a definition. So I generally like to take those three separate, very distinct steps of finding some code that's in my view that doesn't necessarily belong in the view. I then move it to the controller. Once I get that working, I then turn around and move it into the model. Typically, I like to have as much stuff inside of my model as possible. At the end of the day, this ends up looking a lot nicer. We just have definition.topUser, and I think this looks a lot better. This, once again, is kind of a somewhat contrived example, so there are definitely a lot of other situations where you can get even more code, even more use out of it by porting it over to your model. Typically you have some purists who will even say that your controller is supposed to be super, super thin to the point where there should be, 5 lines of code or less. And I don't think that's 100% necessary if you're just starting out. I fully believe and get behind, if any of you are familiar with Why a Lucky Stiff, Why's Pointing Guide to Ruby. Okay, check it out if you've never heard of it. But he was kind of like anti-best practices, anti-patterns. Like if you were, and very much just like go out there and write code. So I do highly encourage that, and get your stuff working. But once you have it working, it's nice if you can then kind of put it in the right places. Just remember that we want to have no SQL in our view. We want to have no more than 13 actions on our controller. We always want to shoot for 7. 7 is our magic number. If we go under, that's perfectly fine. This is not Price is Right, or is right. One of those. And you want to move your logic from your view to your controller, and from your controller to your model. So no matter what, just remember MVC. And MVC stands for Models Hold Logic, Not Views or Controllers. It's pretty catchy. Does anybody have any questions? Y'all are a really quiet crowd. Yes? The question is, when should you move stuff out of your models and into your modules? So, for those of you not familiar with Ruby, you can kind of mix in methods to classes, to models with modules. And And typically, I say you should do that whenever you have a piece of code that is actually duplicated across multiple modules. That is a really, really good candidate. So in that situation, you're not rewriting that code. There are some people, and this is kind of a hot button issue on Twitter, like as of like 2 days ago or something, where people are splitting up their classes using just a bunch of modules. And that's your coding style. That's your coding style. But frankly, as long as your logic is in the model or in a module, just like not in the controller, not in the view, like I'm happy. I'm super happy. Ask me how happy I am. I would say super. Anything else? Did that answer your question? Okay. Excellent. That's an affirmative. So did want to give a shout out. I have a couple gems out there if you want to. I'm always interested in community feedback. I have a gem called Keytar. I'm not going to tell you what it does. You just have to go check it out. I have another one called JohnnyCache. It does method level caching. Still looking for feedback. Also, wanted to mention yet again that I teach AntiPatterns. It is a 16-hour long, 2-day, very comprehensive, hands-on version of this. This is not even the tip of the iceberg. This is super, super condensed. The class actually does a lot of hands-on material, actually gives you code that somebody else wrote that you get to refactor. So it's a really good opportunity. So that was kind of like a fake questions, but I do have just a little bit more material. So the biggest anti-pattern of all, going along with that Y reference I made previously, is not writing and shipping code. If you are sitting here and you're just getting started, go home tonight, like crack open a book and just like write like 10 lines of code. I don't care if they like error out or don't do anything, just like write code. It'll make you feel good. And then at the end of the day, eventually it'll maybe work, and then you can maybe put it on a website, and then that is how we get to the solution of just pick a project, stick with it, and eventually ship it. You will get better. That's really all there is to it. You can also come to Austin on Rails. There's Austin RB. There are classes. If you haven't figured out, I teach one. There's a meta-programming class taught by Ethan, the gentleman who asked that awesome question. If you're interested in that, ourschool.com. And please ask questions on Stack Overflow. Like I told all my students in my last class to ask questions on Stack Overflow, and I'm not just joking. Like I asked probably 10 questions in the last month on Stack Overflow, and I'm the smarter version for it. And like there's tons of other people who like vote up my questions because they had the same questions. So there's no problems with asking questions. So get involved. And one very last thing, I promise this is finally it. I'm very interested in seeing that Austin has some of the best Rails developers. Lots of people are going to San Francisco, well, not lots of people, but there's a lot of Rails developers in San Francisco, and I think we can compete with them. So I've been teaching some Rails classes, some just basic beginner Rails classes, but we kind of have this problem of lots of people come up and they say, okay, hey, we're looking to hire, but everybody's looking to hire very experienced, very advanced. Everybody wants like the best of the best. Everybody wants to hire Tenderlove, right? But who wants to hire okay, I just finished my first book, I just finished my first thing, I kind of understood sort of what he was kind of talking about, but I need some, some guidance, like I need a project to work with. So I am proposing a kind of a mentorship program, maybe like a 1 month long program where, say, 2 to 3 people who are just beginning Rails. They do have some experience, but they're not exactly purely beginners. Team up with people who are interested, who do know Rails. It's pretty beneficial to everybody involved. You get to meet if you're a mentor, you get to meet some people who are just kind of up and coming and get the opportunity to make those connections. You know, maybe you'll meet your next employee or intern, you never know. And if you are one of the mentees, it's pretty obvious. You get to work with other people on actual projects, and you get to solve the biggest anti-pattern, which is making and shipping code. So if you are, in order for me to be able to do this, I'm going to have just a beginner class. This is kind of all in theory as of now. I'm looking for 1 to 2, possibly maximum of 3 mentors, and want to just do this as a trial run. So if you're interested as a mentor in doing this, please send me a message on Twitter or see me after this, and then from there we will work on finding students. So that leads me to my last slide, which is, does anybody actually have any questions? Because this is actually my last slide. Yes? My next beginner's class. I don't know. So I feel like a broken record. CabForward does offer a Rails, what's it called? 0 to Rails 3 class. That is available. Unfortunately, the class that I taught over at UT is, I don't know when I'm going to offer that again. I think also Geek Austin, they offer a Rails class, and I've heard good things about that one as well. Really at the end of the day, like no matter who's teaching you or how you're learning, like getting out there and just writing code is the way to go. All right, typically about this time are we doing a raffle? Anybody? Yeah. So, if you want to.
Everybody give Richard a round of applause.